بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا ومولانا محمد وعلى آل سيدنا ومولانا محمد وبارك وسلم. اللهم ربنا يا مولانا اللهم ربنا يا مولانا لا علم لنا سبحانك لا علم لنا إلا ما علمتنا إنك أنت العليم الحكيم. اللهم ربنا أرنا الحق حقا وارزقنا اتباعه وأرنا الباطل باطلا وارزقنا اجتنابه. اللهم أرنا حقائق الأشياء كما هي. ربنا زدنا علما وعملا وإخلاصا يا رب العالمين. اللهم انصر أولياءك في مشارق الأرض ومغاربها. اللهم انصرهم على عدوك وعدوهم إنك على كل شيء قدير. اللهم فرج عنا وعن إخواننا في مشارق الأرض ومغاربها. اللهم انصرهم على عدوك وعدوهم إنك على كل شيء قدير. اللهم فرج عنا وعن إخواننا في مشارق الأرض ومغاربها. اللهم نفس كربنا وكربهم وثبت أقدامنا وأقدامهم والطف بنا وبهم يا أرحم الراحمين. وصل وسلم على سيدنا وحبيبنا ومولانا وشفينا محمد وآله وصحبه أزواجه وذريته أجمعين برحمتك يا أرحم الراحمين آمين. Okay, Bismillah. I want to look at this review of a book on Kant, a new book, I guess, by Samantha Matherene, Seeing More, Kant's Theory of Imagination. The title sort of interested me because I'm interested in the theme of seeing more, how we perceive the world and all those things. So seeing more answers two questions. Okay, good. What is the imagination in Kant? The concept of imagination. And what role does it play in his philosophical picture, his worldview? The overall picture which emerges from his three critiques and other works, I guess. It is named for the reading Samantha Matherene proposes. The imagination is a capacity to see more than what is immediately given. So more rather than something totally new, I guess. Is that it? Imagination is a capacity to see more than what is immediately given. In senses, I get this capacity is woven through our lives. We use it in simple perception, in appreciating beauty and sublimity, and in fulfilling our moral obligations. So for Kant, generally, and I guess for other philosophers as well, imagination is whatever it is. In a way, a bridge between perception and thought. And in Kant, I guess imagination. Obviously, in third critique, for example, it has a much wider scope. But in the context of the first critique, it's the faculty which synthesizes. Synthesizes um, sensory data into coherent object of experience. This capacity is woven through our lives. We use it in simple perception, in appreciating beauty and sublimity, in fulfilling our moral obligation. Uh, the book's undertaking is difficult. It's unclear whether imagination has the same meaning across Kant's corpus, as I mentioned, for example. Further, the imagination is difficult to locate in Kant's taxonomy of mental faculties. Does it belong to sensibility or to the understanding? Does it belong squarely to the faculty of cognition as opposed to the faculty of feeling and desire? Okay. Does it belong to sensibility or does it belong squarely to the faculty of cognition as opposed to the faculty of feeling and desire? As Matherene notes, these difficulties have led prominent scholars to be skeptics about Kant's account of imagination. Skeptics or skeptical. And they hold that the imagination is of little importance to Kant's system, or worse, I guess, except for Heidegger. Probably they don't consider Heidegger as a Kant scholar. The Kant's account of imagination introduces confusion. Okay, yeah, this seems right. Matherene, I mean, not that it does, but this review of scholarship. Matherene, by contrast, characterizes herself as an imagination enthusiast. She argues that we can attribute to Kant a unified account of imagination as a single cognitive capacity. Uh, and Kant's theory of imagination is interesting from a contemporary perspective. So both seeing more stand out in its focus and its breadth. Past treatments in Kant's theory of imagination tend to fall into two categories: treatment that focus on something different in Kant's work, and comment on the imagination as a minor character and treatments that focus on the imagination from a specific angle and or in a particular part of Kant's philosophy. Matherene makes the imagination the protagonist and comments on its role in all major parts of Kant's system. Okay. Much of the book is technical scholarship. Given this, it is admirable how accessible and vivid the book remains. It is a trove of great examples. Okay, that's always good. Some curated from Kant's work, and some supplied by Matherene herself. There's the music, there is literature, and there are many flowers. I will now briefly describe the main claims and arguments and saying more. After that, I will close with two worries about Matherene's reading. Okay. Regarding the location, the imagination in Kant's taxonomy of the faculty, Matherene argues that it's part of sensibility, as opposed to the part of understanding or its own independent capacity. She argues that this fits well with Kant's theory of two fundamental sources of knowledge, that is, sensibility and understanding. What about reason? I guess that's a form of Kant's own taxonomizing, found in his anthropology and metaphysics lectures, notes what found in his anthropology and metaphysics lectures, Kant's own taxonomizing, found in his where Kant consistently situates his analysis of the imagination and his discussion of sensibility. Okay. And the description of imagination and understanding we find in critiques, with the exception of the B deduction the revised version or second edition of critique, where the spontaneity and of the imagination is linked to spontaneity of understanding. Matherene argues that we can account for the imagination spontaneity while still locating it in sensibility. That's interesting, because generally it's some sensibility for Kant is passivity, and spontaneity is the exact opposite of passivity. That only lets us act in ways that are constitutively shaped by the receptive aspects of, in a way that is shaped by the receptive. Sorry, go back. Matherene argues that we can account for the imagination's spontaneity while still locating it in sensibility. It is a relative kind of spontaneity that only lets us act in ways that are constitutively shaped by the receptive aspects of sensibility. Which makes sense in a way, because the problem in Kant, one of the problems in Kant's philosophy is that you have sensibility, which is pure passivity. So our senses receive information. And then you have understanding, which is freedom or spontaneity. So these are exact opposites. So in a way you need something which bridges these, which is imagination. So you can, this does bridging precisely because it partakes in passivity as well as spontaneity. Okay, everything we imagine must be spatio-temporal and use the material from the manifold of sensibility. The imagination and spontaneity cannot create something new out of nothing, but instead finds new ways to put together the material received from the senses. But then what is the difference between spontaneity and understanding? And the solution, Kant's bridging solution in a way is, at least if we read it this way, will generate a regress. The spontaneity of the understanding, by contrast, does not face the same constraints. Okay. But then this is just an abstraction. How can we even imagine understanding to be totally devoid of material constraints? When forming the concept of freedom as a first cause, or of God as the most real being, the understanding operates without intuitions. Okay, and therefore is not tied to sensibilities, receptivity in the way the imagination is. Okay. So the cause, the concept of cause. Okay, let's. I'm not entirely convinced, but let's go ahead. Kant's theory of imagination as a faculty of seeing more, according to Matherene, sets him apart from his predecessors. For Hobbes, Wolff, and Baumgarten, the imagination is fantasy, a faculty that represents things that are currently absent or that do not exist in the first place. Yeah, that's what generally or popularly imagination is considered to be. By contrast, Matherene reads Kant as holding that imagining pervades our engagement with the real and the present. There's no doubt about that. That's modern psychology proves that. As much as with what is not real and present. So imagining pervades our engagement with the real and present as much as that which is not real and not present. It enables a kind of sensory awareness of more than is currently given to us. Probably the role of repetition of experience and extrapolation. Part 2, 3, and 4 of the book describe how seeing more appears in theoretical, aesthetic and moral roles. On Matherene's reading of Kant, imagination is crucial to perception. While sensation provides a manifold of representation, it is only through the imagination that we grasp it as a spatio-temporally determined object. Imagination creates a perceptual imagination or intuition by working on the manifold given to us through sensation, which Matherene called the intuition of sense. In perceiving a mum, for example, my imagination pulls together sensory representation: yellow petals, a thin green stem. Was it mum? Alternating green leaves, etc., including sensory input we received in the past, but we are not currently receiving. Past, like that of stem hidden in the vase and the mum seen from the other side of the room. The imagination is part of sensibility, but its activity is guided by concepts, such as the concept of a mum and its schema, which Matherene described as gestalt or outline. Are these empirical concepts or rational concepts? In his first critique, the imagination appears prominently as having a priori use. Kant takes a priori use to underlie the empirical use of the imagination just described. The imagination relates closely to space and time as pure forms of intuition, and to the category as pure concept of understanding. Matherene defines what she calls mediating as opposed to radical reading of this relationship. What's the difference? So Matherene defends what she calls the mediating as opposed to radical reading of this relationship, while other scholars read the imagination as producing the pure form. And the categories, Matherene claims that the a priori exercise of imagination mediates between the pure intuitions given through sensibility and categories given through the understanding. She argues that reading the transcendental aesthetics, the transcendental deduction, and the schematism, while applying the concept of images, she defends in part one of the books. Okay, she argues that reading the transcendental aesthetics, the transcendental deduction, and schematism while applying. So she argues that reading. Okay, so the emphasis on that while applying the concept she defends in part one of the book speaks for the mediating model. According to Matherene, space and time as performed are given to us in sensibility. But based on the pure form specimen, the imagination also produces pure a priori intuitions. Through synthesis, these pure intuitions, which are produced on Matherene reading, turns out to be the schemata of the categories, which she calls stencil-like rules. Just as imaginative process is generally concept-guided, the mathematical categories and their schemata guide the composition of representation contained in the manifold of empirical intuitions into perceptual image. For example, when hearing a series of tones as song, the imagination's mediating role also works the other way. Matherene describes the dynamical categories and their schemata as guiding the intellectual synthesis and involvement, connecting perception together in recognitional judgments. For example, when connecting the perceptions of the liquid and the solid water together into a representative of an object or representation and objective order of succession that we judge to obtain. Matherene reads the aesthetic use of imagination as an especially productive case of seeing more. She describes the free play between the imagination and understanding that Kant described as a response to the beautiful as an open-ended activity in which the imaginative perspective we adopt on a beautiful object spur our conceptual perspective on it and vice versa. For example, reading William Blake's poem Sunflower Many involved adopting a variety of conceptual perspective related to, say, the concept of time weariness, travel weariness, sunflower, and sun. We shape and are shaped by how we imagine, say, the sunflower, the traveler, the course of the sun. The aesthetic activity of the imagination, according to Matherene, is of cognitive value because it can deepen our understanding of concepts. In line with seeing more's general claim that imagining is concept guided, Matherene rejects the precognitive reading of Kant's free play, which claims that it does not involve concepts or different types of concepts. She characterizes her own reading as multi-cognitive, cognitive, creative, and conceptually rich. Finally, Matherene argues that the imagination plays a role in our action. She claims that it aids us seeing more by imaginatively projecting different possible ways in which human beings might be happy or act morally. We can imagine focusing on wealth or intellectual activity as different paths to heaven, or to help us choose a moral course of action, we can imagine a world in which everyone feeling rushed cuts in line at grocery store. The imagination also makes moral concepts sensible to us. Seeing more points to a variety of ways in which the exhibition of moral concepts appears in Kant's ethics and aesthetics and his treatment of beauty, art, sublimity, moral ideals, and moral examples. For instance, we can indirectly exhibit the moral idea of the sublimity of our practical rationality and freedom vis-a-vis intuitions of very powerful objects in nature, such as volcanoes or raging thunderstorms. Directly, for instance, we can indirectly exhibit moral ideas of sublimity of rationality. In imagining a white lily, we can exhibit the moral idea of innocence. We can imagine an ideal friend and imagine Henry Norris, who refused Henry VIII's demand to lie to condemn Anne Boleyn, as someone who is guided by moral motives. Let me turn into two worries. Okay, please do. First is the complexity of Kant account on Matheren's reading and the sound. The second is about the imagination in the taxonomy of faculties. Matheren's more nuanced, bipartite bipartite picture of sensibility introduces its own distinction into Kant's account, most prominently that between intuition of sense and intuition of imagination. This helps her clarify what is unique about imagination and supports her interpretation of imagination as a unified faculty. But this also complicates the picture that already contains a dizzying number of distinctions. Um, And it's not just a dizzying number of distinctions, but it seems arbitrary, at least through this reading. Matherene is careful to show textual evidence for her distinctions, especially at pointers to Kant's unpublished remarks on Kestner's treatises, treatises. Even so, I find myself reluctant to import distinction not explicitly made in Kant's main corpus. Matherene is correct to suggest that Kant thought of imagination as part of sensibility. She is correct to suggest that Kant thought of the imagination as part of sensibility through most of his work. His own taxonomizing shows this, but I still question how firm the line between sense and understanding is. In Kant's account and in Matheren's interpretation, especially when thinking about the source of the imagination, relative spontaneity, as Kant does in the B deduction. What happened? In B deduction, I think when I converted it into PDF, it cut the last paragraph. So let's read the last paragraph from the actual website. So we sort of so Matherene is correct to suggest that Kant's thought of the imagination is part of sensibility. Through most of his work, his own taxonomizing shows that, but I still question how firm the line between sensibility and understanding is. In Kant's account and in Matheren's interpretation, especially when thinking about the source of the imagination's relative spontaneity, as Kant does in the B deduction, seeing more carefully situates the imagination and its relationship to sensation and understanding. It has little to say about its relationship to the faculty of feeling and desire. This omission is understandable, as Matherene explains. Kant locates imagination in the faculty of cognition, and the faculty of cognition also contains sensation and understanding, while it opposes feeling and desire in Kant's tripartite division of the fundamental faculty. But especially in considering the aesthetics and the moral role of capacity to receive, feeling and desire seems crucial. For example, in her discussion of what seeing more looks like, in the moral context, Matherene discusses how Jane Austen's Emma imaginatively exhibits the moral idea of friendship. I suspect that imagining the friendship between Emma and Mr. Knightley centrally involves imagining both the characters, both the characters' feeling and desire and having our own. On Kant's account, can imagining involve feeling and desiring? While thinking through how feeling and desire play into our imagining might be a taxonomical pain, it should fit into Matheren's framework and would expand our understanding of seeing more. Yeah, she can just develop her own thought and not try to interpret Kant. I mean, she can draw on Kant's, but you don't need to necessarily fit Kant into your straitjacket. Matherine's enthusiasm for the imagination is infectious. Seeing more accomplishes what only stellar scholarship does. It shifts how we see Kant's philosophical picture. This is achieved by making the imagination a protagonist in the system. The central role of imagination method described Kant in turn gives us a new perspective on the imagination itself. Okay, uh, through this review, it is not entirely clear what that new role is, except in a very bare minimum outlines. I hope that the Kantian capacity to see more inspire new lines of inquiry in contemporary philosophy. Okay, so probably we should. Uh, the book is worth looking at it. Okay, سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك نشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت نستغفرك ونتوب إليك. صلى وسلم على سيدنا ومولانا محمد وعلى سيدنا ومولانا محمد وبارك وسلم وسلم سبحان ربك رب العزة عما يصفون وسلام على المرسلين والحمد لله رب العالمين برحمتك يا أرحم الراحمين آمين آمين يا رب العالمين.